Sevastopol, 1942. German commanders were certain the city would fall within weeks. Soviet defenders seemed exhausted, demoralized, finished. Then one soldier took position in the rubble and began eliminating enemy troops with such deadly precision that entire companies refused to advance. The Germans had made a fatal assumption, one that would cost them dearly.
Sevastopol, June 1942. The German Sixth Army had been besieging the Soviet naval fortress for 8 months, pouring men and artillery into what had become one of the bloodiest campaigns on the Eastern Front. Wehrmacht commanders were confident that the city would fall within weeks, that Soviet defenders were exhausted and demoralized, that one final push would break their resistance. German soldiers moved through ruined streets with increasing boldness, believing the Russians were too weak to mount effective opposition. Then a young woman with a rifle took position in the rubble of a destroyed apartment building, put her eye to a scope, and began systematically killing German soldiers with such precision and efficiency that entire companies refused to advance through sectors where she operated. Her name was Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She was 25 years old, and over the next few months she would kill 309 enemy soldiers, becoming the most lethal female sniper in history, and a problem that German command could not solve, no matter how many resources they devoted to eliminating her. But this story doesn't start in Sevastopol. It starts 2 years earlier in Kiev, when a young history student named Lyudmila Pavlichenko tried to enlist in the Soviet military as war with Germany became inevitable. She walked into a Red Army recruiting office in 1940 with her university marksmanship certificates and her shooting competition trophies, explaining that she had been training as a sniper since she was 14 years old and wanted to serve her country. The recruiting officer looked at her like she had asked to join the ballet. He smiled condescendingly and suggested that she could better serve the Soviet Union by working in a factory or nursing wounded soldiers. Combat roles, he explained with exaggerated patience as if speaking to a child, were for men. Women were too emotional, too physically weak, too psychologically fragile to function effectively in combat situations. Lyudmila listened to this lecture with growing fury. She was not some delicate flower who fainted at the sight of blood. She had grown up in a rough neighborhood in Kiev where being tough was a survival requirement. At 14, she had joined a shooting club because a boy had bragged that girls couldn't shoot, and she was determined to prove him wrong. She discovered she had natural talent for marksmanship, an ability to control her breathing and heartbeat, to calculate distance and wind, to wait with infinite patience for the perfect shot. By 16, she was winning regional competitions. By 18, she was one of the best sport shooters in Ukraine, male or female. She had logged hundreds of hours of range time, studied ballistics and trajectory, practiced until she could hit targets at 800 meters with consistency that professional soldiers couldn't match. And this recruiting officer, who probably couldn't hit a target at 200 meters, was telling her that she was unsuitable for military service because of her gender. She argued with him for an hour, showing him documentation of her shooting scores, her competition victories, her technical knowledge of rifles and ammunition. He remained unmoved. The Red Army had regulations, he explained, and those regulations were quite clear about women in combat roles. She could serve as a nurse, a radio operator, a clerk. Those were appropriate roles for women. Shooting enemy soldiers was men's work. Lyudmila walked out of that recruiting office understanding that she would have to wait for circumstances to force the military to reconsider their idiotic prejudices. Those circumstances arrived on June 22, 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history. 3 million German soldiers crashed across the Soviet border in a blitzkrieg that devastated Soviet defenses and drove hundreds of miles into Soviet territory within weeks. The Red Army was reeling, suffering catastrophic casualties, losing entire armies to German encirclement. Within a month, the Wehrmacht had killed or captured over 2 million Soviet soldiers and was advancing on multiple fronts with such speed that Soviet collapse seemed inevitable. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival, and suddenly the question of whether women could serve in combat roles became irrelevant compared to the question of whether there would be a Soviet Union left to have policies about anything. Lyudmila went back to the recruiting office, this time finding it overwhelmed with volunteers and conscripts. The orderly process of 1940 replaced by barely controlled chaos as the Red Army tried to absorb hundreds of thousands of new soldiers while simultaneously replacing catastrophic losses at the front. She pushed her way to a harried recruiting officer and stated flatly that she was a trained sniper, and they needed to send her to the front immediately. The officer, who had probably been processing recruits for 18 hours straight, barely looked at her. He started to direct her toward the nursing corps. Lyudmila cut him off and said something that would define her entire military career. She told him that she had already killed 2 enemy soldiers. It was a lie. She hadn't killed anyone. But it got the officer's attention in ways that competition trophies and shooting certificates had not. He asked her to explain. Lyudmila, thinking fast, claimed that she had been in a village when German troops arrived, that she had grabbed a rifle from a dead Soviet soldier and shot 2 Germans before escaping. The story was completely fabricated, but it was plausible enough given the chaos of the invasion, and more importantly, it reframed her from a female civilian wanting to play soldier into someone who had already engaged the enemy and proven she could kill. The officer studied her for a long moment, then shrugged and assigned her to the 25th Rifle Division as a sniper. If she was lying, she would wash out quickly enough. If she was telling the truth, the Red Army needed every killer it could get. Lyudmila arrived at the front near Odessa in August 1941, one of the very few women assigned to combat roles in a military that remained deeply skeptical about female soldiers. The male soldiers in her unit treated her arrival as a joke. They made crude comments about what she should really be doing for the war effort, suggested that she would panic and run the first time she heard gunfire, offered to protect her when the fighting started. Their platoon commander, a grizzled sergeant who had been fighting since the invasion began, was openly contemptuous. He gave her a rifle and ammunition with the clear expectation that she would fire a few shots, get scared, and request transfer to safer duties. What happened instead was that Lyudmila took position in a destroyed building overlooking a German advance, waited until enemy soldiers came within 400 meters, and killed 2 of them with 2 shots fired 3 seconds apart. The first shot hit a German officer in the chest, dropping him instantly. The second shot hit a soldier who had turned to look at the fallen officer, the bullet entering through his neck and severing his spine. Both men were dead before their comrades realized shots had been fired. Lyudmila had just made her fabricated story true, and in the process she discovered something about herself that would define the next year of her life. She was very good at killing people, and she felt absolutely nothing about it. That absence of emotion was perhaps her greatest asset as a sniper. Many soldiers, even trained marksmen, struggled with the psychological impact of killing enemy soldiers in such a personal way. Artillery crews and bomber pilots killed at a distance that made their targets abstract, but snipers watched through scopes as bullets hit flesh, saw the moment of death in intimate detail, killed people who were sometimes so close that facial expressions were visible. It affected most snipers psychologically, created hesitation or guilt or nightmares. Lyudmila felt none of that. She was hunting, the same way she had hunted targets in competitions, and the fact that these targets were human beings who died when she shot them was simply a fact of war that didn't trouble her conscience. She killed 8 German soldiers in her first week at the front, 15 in her second week, 23 by the end of her first month. Each kill was methodical and professional. She studied German patrol patterns, identified officers and NCOs by their behavior and equipment, positioned herself in locations that offered clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes. She learned to wait for hours without moving, to control her bladder and breathing, to shoot between heartbeats when her body was most stable. She learned which targets were most valuable, prioritizing officers and specialists over ordinary infantry, understanding that killing a company commander created more disruption than killing 10 random soldiers. The male soldiers in her unit stopped making jokes. Her kill count was higher than any of theirs. Her tactics were more sophisticated. Her discipline under fire was absolute. The sergeant who had given her the rifle, expecting her to fail, began seeking her advice on where to position other snipers, recognizing that she understood the geometry of urban warfare better than he did. By October 1941, when German forces were pushing toward Sevastopol, Lyudmila had killed 89 enemy soldiers and earned a reputation that spread beyond her immediate unit. Soviet propaganda officials heard about the female sniper with the extraordinary kill count and saw an opportunity for a morale-boosting story. They arrived at her position with cameras and notebooks, wanting to write articles about the brave Soviet woman defending the motherland. Lyudmila was uncooperative in ways that frustrated the propagandists enormously. She didn't want to talk about defending the motherland or socialist values or the courage of Soviet womanhood. She wanted to talk about sight pictures and ballistic coefficients and the best way to calculate windage at 600 meters. When they asked her how it felt to kill fascists, she responded that it felt like completing a task that needed to be done, no different from solving a math problem or repairing a machine. This was not the emotional narrative the propagandists wanted, but they worked with what they had, producing articles that emphasized her kill count and framed her as proof that Soviet women could fight as effectively as men. The German command took notice of these articles, and they did not like what they read. A female Soviet sniper with nearly 100 confirmed kills was embarrassing on multiple levels. It undermined German soldiers' morale to know that a woman was killing them. It contradicted Nazi ideology about the weakness and inferiority of Slavic peoples. It suggested that Soviet resistance was more effective and more determined than German intelligence had assessed. Wehrmacht officers began directing resources specifically toward finding and eliminating this particular sniper, viewing her as a propaganda problem that needed to be solved through superior German military skill. They sent their own snipers to hunt her, experienced marksmen pulled from other sectors specifically to kill the woman the Soviet propaganda called Lady Death. Lyudmila killed 3 of them in the span of 2 weeks. She studied how German snipers operated, learned their preferred positions and tactics, and set traps that turned their own methods against them. She would deliberately expose herself briefly to draw German sniper fire, note the position from muzzle flash or sound, and then circle around to kill them from an angle they hadn't anticipated. German snipers were trained and competent, but they had been taught to hunt other snipers who followed German tactical doctrine. Lyudmila had learned to shoot in Soviet sporting clubs and had developed her own methods through practice and experimentation. She didn't fight the way German snipers expected, which gave her an advantage that skill alone couldn't overcome. By December 1941, her kill count had reached 187, and she had become a serious problem for German forces around Sevastopol. Entire companies refused to advance through sectors where she was known to operate. German soldiers would see movement in rubble and call in artillery rather than risk having a squad investigate and lose men to a sniper they couldn't locate. The psychological impact of her presence was greater than the actual casualties she inflicted. 300 dead soldiers over 6 months was significant, but not strategically decisive. But the fear and hesitation she created in German forces trying to take Sevastopol had effects that were harder to quantify but genuinely important. The siege of Sevastopol intensified in the spring of 1942 as Germany committed enormous resources to taking the fortress city. The Luftwaffe bombed it day and night. Artillery pounded Soviet positions with shells so heavy that entire buildings collapsed into rubble. German infantry pushed forward in waves, accepting horrific casualties because Hitler had ordered Sevastopol taken regardless of cost. Lyudmila continued operating in this hell, moving through ruins that were being actively destroyed around her, taking shots when opportunities presented, and then relocating before German artillery could target her position. She developed a reputation for almost supernatural survival ability. Buildings would be hit by artillery minutes after she left them. German soldiers would sweep areas where she had been and find only empty shell casings and blood from targets she had killed. She seemed to anticipate German movements, to know where they would attack before they attacked, to disappear whenever they concentrated forces to hunt her. The truth was less mysterious than German soldiers imagined. Lyudmila had learned to read the battlefield, to understand the logic of German tactics, to predict where attacks would focus based on artillery patterns and troop movements. She was playing chess while German commanders thought they were playing checkers, always thinking 3 moves ahead, positioning herself not where the enemy was, but where they were going to be. In June 1942, Lyudmila was wounded by mortar shrapnel that tore through her leg and side. The wounds were serious enough that she was evacuated from Sevastopol, ending her combat career. Her final confirmed kill count was 309 enemy soldiers, including 36 enemy snipers. She was 25 years old and had spent less than a year in active combat, but she had killed more enemy soldiers than most infantry companies eliminated during the entire war. The Red Army recognized her value both as a combat soldier and as a propaganda symbol. They awarded her the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor, and sent her on a tour of Allied countries to demonstrate Soviet resolve and boost support for the war effort. That tour brought her to the United States in August 1942, where she became the first Soviet citizen to be received at the White House by President Franklin Roosevelt. American officials and media didn't quite know what to make of her. She was a young woman who had killed 309 people, a reality that didn't fit comfortably into American ideas about femininity or appropriate female behavior. Journalists asked her questions that revealed their complete inability to understand who she was or what she represented. They asked about her uniform, whether she wore makeup at the front, if she had a boyfriend. They treated her like a curiosity, a novelty, a woman playing at war rather than a soldier who had fought more effectively than most men. Lyudmila's patience with this condescension lasted approximately 1 day. At a press conference in Washington, a journalist asked her why Soviet women were allowed to wear such unflattering uniforms instead of something more stylish. Lyudmila responded with a speech that was reported in newspapers across America and shocked audiences who expected feminine modesty and deference. She said that she had killed 309 fascist occupiers, and she found it odd that American journalists were more concerned with her appearance than with her combat record. She pointed out that Soviet women were fighting and dying to defend their country while American women were apparently expected to prioritize looking attractive. She suggested that if American journalists were so concerned about fashion, perhaps they should spend less time asking stupid questions and more time supporting the soldiers who were actually fighting fascism. The speech was delivered in Russian through a translator, but the fury in her voice needed no translation. American officials were mortified. This was not how visiting dignitaries were supposed to behave, especially not young women who were supposed to be grateful for American hospitality. But Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, was delighted. She had been frustrated by the condescending coverage of Lyudmila and invited her to stay at the White House, where they developed a genuine friendship. Eleanor understood what the male journalists did not, that Lyudmila was a serious soldier who deserved respect for her combat record, not condescending questions about cosmetics and romance. Lyudmila toured the United States for several months, speaking at rallies and fundraisers, making the case for opening a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. She was extraordinarily effective as a speaker, blunt and unapologetic in ways that American audiences found both shocking and compelling. She didn't perform femininity the way American women were expected to. She didn't smile constantly or soften her language or apologize for having opinions. She spoke about killing German soldiers with the same matter-of-fact tone that a factory worker might use to describe assembling cars. This made some audiences uncomfortable, but it also made her impossible to dismiss or ignore. American military officials who met with her made the same mistake that Soviet recruiting officers had made in 1940. They assumed that her combat record was exaggerated, that Soviet propaganda had inflated her kill count, that a young woman couldn't really have killed 309 enemy soldiers through marksmanship and tactical skill. Some of them said this directly to her face, suggesting that her fame was manufactured for propaganda purposes. Lyudmila would respond by offering to demonstrate her shooting ability. On several occasions, she did exactly that. going to American military ranges and outperforming trained American marksmen so decisively that it eliminated any doubt about her capabilities. One particular incident captured the dynamic perfectly. An American general, skeptical of her claimed abilities, arranged for her to shoot against several of his best riflemen at a range outside Washington. He set up targets at various distances and told Lyudmila she could use whatever rifle she wanted from the base armory. Lyudmila examined the available rifles, selected one, spent 5 minutes adjusting the sights, and then proceeded to hit targets at 800 meters with accuracy that stunned everyone watching. The American marksmen she was competing against were excellent shots who had trained for years. She was better than all of them, and she made it look effortless. The general, to his credit, apologized for doubting her and asked if she would be willing to provide training to American snipers. Lyudmila politely declined, pointing out that she was needed back in the Soviet Union. She returned to the USSR in late 1942 and spent the rest of the war training Soviet snipers, passing on the tactics and techniques she had developed through a year of combat. She was too valuable as a trainer and propaganda symbol to risk in combat again, but she chafed at being kept away from the front. She wanted to fight, to add to her kill count, to continue hunting German soldiers until the war ended. But the decision had been made at levels far above her rank, and she accepted it with the discipline that had made her an effective soldier. After the war ended, Lyudmila struggled to adjust to civilian life in ways that many combat veterans understood intimately. She had spent formative years learning to kill efficiently and feeling nothing about it. That emotional disconnection had been an asset in combat, but it made peacetime relationships difficult. She married twice, both marriages ending in divorce. She had a son who grew up knowing his mother was a war hero, but struggling to reconcile that with the distant, emotionally unavailable woman who raised him. She worked as a historian, completing her university degree and researching naval history, trying to find purpose in a world that no longer required her particular skills. She gave interviews occasionally, talking about the war and her combat experiences with the same matter-of-fact tone she had used in 1942. She never expressed regret about the men she had killed, never suggested that killing 309 human beings had been psychologically damaging or morally complicated. When asked how she felt about it, she would explain that they were fascist invaders occupying her country, killing her people, and eliminating them was necessary work that someone had to do. She happened to be very good at that work, so she did it to the best of her ability. The emotional content that journalists expected, the hand-wringing about the horror of war or the tragedy of taking human life, was completely absent from her descriptions. This made some interviewers uncomfortable, this woman who spoke about killing with the emotional affect of someone describing a technical process. They wanted her to perform femininity, to show that despite being a soldier, she was still fundamentally a woman with maternal instincts and emotional sensitivity. Lyudmila refused to perform for them. She was who she was, shaped by war and combat into something that didn't fit neatly into peacetime categories of appropriate female behavior. She had killed more enemy soldiers than almost any Soviet sniper, male or female, and she felt no need to apologize for that or soften it for audiences who found her unsettling. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in Moscow in 1974 at the age of 58, her body worn down by wounds from the war and decades of heavy smoking. She was buried with full military honors, her coffin draped in the Soviet flag, carried by soldiers who understood that they were burying one of the deadliest combat soldiers the Red Army had ever produced. But even in death, the coverage of her life focused as much on the novelty of her gender as on her combat achievements. Articles described her as the beautiful sniper, the deadly woman, Lady Death. The emphasis was always on the surprising combination of femininity and lethality, as if the two were naturally contradictory, and her existence was a fascinating anomaly. What those articles missed, what most analysis of her life has missed, is that Lyudmila Pavlichenko's story is not primarily about a woman succeeding in a male domain. It's about competence being dismissed because of prejudice, about assumptions overriding evidence, about institutions being so certain they know who can and cannot perform certain roles that they ignore or minimize exceptional ability when it appears in unexpected forms. The Soviet recruiting officer who tried to send her to the nursing corps in 1940 wasn't evil or deliberately trying to waste talent. He was operating from assumptions that seemed completely natural and obvious to him, that women were unsuitable for combat because they were emotionally and physically weaker than men. Those assumptions were so deeply embedded that evidence contradicting them, like Lyudmila's shooting scores and competition victories, was dismissed as irrelevant. The American journalists who asked about her makeup and uniform in 1942 weren't trying to belittle her achievements. They were operating from cultural frameworks that defined women primarily through appearance and relationships, frameworks so strong that even a woman who had killed 309 enemy soldiers was still evaluated first on whether she was attractive and whether she had a boyfriend. The American general who doubted her shooting ability wasn't being deliberately insulting. He was expressing skepticism that seemed completely reasonable to him, based on assumptions about female physical capabilities in Soviet propaganda that were overriding the actual documentary evidence of her combat record. All of these people were making the same fundamental error. They were allowing their assumptions about who could be competent at certain tasks to override evidence of actual competence, and that error had real consequences. If Soviet recruiting officers had accepted Lyudmila in 1940 instead of 1941, she might have received better training, might have been positioned more effectively when the invasion came, might have killed even more enemy soldiers during the crucial early months when the Soviet Union was fighting for survival. If American military officials had taken her seriously in 1942, instead of treating her as a propaganda curiosity, they might have learned from her tactics and techniques, might have improved American sniper training in ways that saved lives in later campaigns. The pattern repeats endlessly throughout history. Competent people are dismissed because they don't fit expected templates. Their abilities are ignored or minimized because the people evaluating them are so certain about who can and cannot perform certain roles that they don't seriously consider evidence contradicting those certainties. Sometimes this happens because of gender, sometimes because of race or class or age or credentials or any of the countless ways that humans categorize each other and decide who deserves serious consideration. Lyudmila Pavlichenko proved that a young woman could be one of the most lethal soldiers in the largest war in human history. She killed 309 enemy combatants through skill and discipline and absolute emotional control. She survived a year of combat in conditions that killed or wounded millions of soldiers. She demonstrated abilities that exceeded those of trained male snipers, not occasionally, but consistently throughout her combat career. And despite all of that evidence, despite the documented record of her achievements, people continued to be surprised that a woman could do what she had done, continued to treat her as an anomaly rather than as evidence that assumptions about gender and combat capability might be fundamentally wrong. The men who ignored her in 1940, who dismissed her abilities in 1942, who doubted her competence despite overwhelming evidence, made a mistake that was invisible to them because it aligned perfectly with their existing beliefs. They thought they were being realistic and practical, applying common sense understanding about human capabilities. They were actually just being prejudiced in ways that wasted extraordinary talent and cost lives. Lyudmila tried to serve her country in 1940 and was turned away because a recruiting officer knew that women couldn't be soldiers. She tried again in 1941 when desperation forced the military to reconsider their assumptions, and she proceeded to demonstrate exactly how wrong those assumptions had been. They ignored a young woman who wanted to fight. It was a big mistake. She became the most effective sniper of the siege of Sevastopol, killed more enemy soldiers than entire companies, created psychological effects that disrupted German operations across multiple sectors. All of that capability was almost wasted because a recruiting officer in 1940 was absolutely certain that women were unsuitable for combat roles. His certainty felt like knowledge, felt like obvious truth, felt like common sense. It was just prejudice, expensive prejudice that the Soviet Union could barely afford during a war for survival. They were lucky that circumstances forced them to reconsider before it was too late. History is full of examples where the reconsideration never happened, where talent was wasted completely because assumptions were never challenged, where the Lyudmila Pavlichenkos of the world were turned away and never got a second chance to prove what they could do.